Afternoon, everyone. Calling to order the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities.
Madame Chair, j'aimerais faire un point d'ordre, s'il vous plaît.
A point of order, please, Madam Chair. I would simply like to draw everyone's attention to the fact that the NDP tabled a motion to extend the work of the committee.
Yes.
Oh.
And so you're not part of the quorum. So you just have to wait until you're signed in. So if we could get the meeting started, and then when your whip comes in and files the appropriate papers, then we'll continue on. So we'll start again with welcome to everybody to the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities, 42nd Parliament First Session. Pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, April 20th, 2016, Bill C-10, an act to amend the Air Canada Public Participation Act and to provide for certain other measures. We are also joined by the Parliamentary Secretary, Ms. Kate Young, who's with us as well today, and of course our Honourable Minister of Transport, Marc Garneau, and his two staff, Catherine Higgins, Associate Assistant Deputy Minister Policy, and Danielle Blessoli, Senior Counsel. Welcome. We appreciate very much having you here today, and I will turn the floor over to you, Minister Garneau.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee for organizing today and for allowing me to provide testimony in relation to Bill C-10. Je suis très heureux de me retrouver.
I'm delighted to appear before you today in order to study Bill C-10, outlining amendments to the Air Canada Public Participation Act.
Will grant Air Canada the flexibility to be competitive in the face of a constantly evolving air transport sector. At the same time, this bill continues to support Canada's aerospace sector by reinforcing the government's expectation that Air Canada will undertake aircraft maintenance in certain parts of the country. Nous cherchons à modifier l'alinéa.
We are seeking to amend Section 6(1)(d) of the Act that presently indicate that Air Canada must also include provisions in its articles of continuance requiring it to maintain operational and overhaul centres in the city of Winnipeg, in Mississauga, and in the Montreal urban community. The suggested changes will amend the mention of the cities of Winnipeg and Mississauga and the Montreal urban community. Instead, we will mention the provinces of Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. We're also proposing to amend the mention pertaining to the operational and overhaul centres. This will be replaced. We will talk about airplane maintenance activities, as long as this involves, of course, work related to the cells, the engines, the parts, and the equipment overall. The bill will also set out that Air Canada has no limits as to the volume or the type of airplane maintenance activities that it will undertake or will have undertaken in Manitoba, in Ontario, and in Quebec. Same thing applies with regard to the levels of employment it will maintain. Even if this maintains the expectation that Air Canada will ensure the maintenance of airplanes in these provinces, this will also allow the carrier to organize these activities in a way that is adapted to the evolution of airport and airline transportation in Canada.
To compete in an aggressive global marketplace. If Air Canada were not able to drive the best possible value for money, the result would be higher costs for the company and ultimately for the traveling public and shippers. Le 17 février 2016.
On February 17, 2016, Air Canada announced that it would cooperate with the Government of Quebec with a view to creating a centre of excellence in airplane maintenance following on the heels of the purchase by the carrier of up to 75 C-Series produced by Bombardier. According to the Government of Quebec, this Centre of Excellence would be able to create up to 1,000 jobs for the Quebec aerospace sector, on top of the jobs created for the production of these airplanes. Following upon this announcement, the Government of Quebec and Air Canada announced an agreement in order to put an end to litigation with regard to the compliance by Air Canada with the Act, the Air Canada Public Participation Act, once these Bombardier planes will have been negotiated for purchase by Air Canada.
Air Canada announced an agreement with Manitoba to create a Western Canada Centre of Excellence in that province. This centre will result in the creation of 150 new jobs in the aircraft maintenance sector as of 2017, with the potential for additional jobs in the future. Si nous regroupons toutes ces nouvelles
Added together, all of this positive news leads us to believe that this is an ideal opportunity to modernize the Air Canada Public Participation Act in order to allow Air Canada to react more effectively to the evolution of market conditions.
competitive into the future, it must be able to adapt its supply chain to manage its costs and remain competitive, as all of its competitors are doing. Bill C-10 will allow the carrier to do this, while ensuring that it remains committed to undertaking aircraft maintenance activities in 3 communities. This is consistent with Canada's policy to maintain a robust and competitive air transport sector well into the future, while also supporting the employment of highly skilled workers in the aerospace sector. Members of the committee, I now welcome your questions. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Garneau. We appreciate that very much. And over to Ms. Block for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you once again, Minister, for joining us and speaking to this piece of legislation. I do have a number of questions, so I hope I'll be able to get through them in the 6 minutes that I have. Minister, I am wondering, when did you first get the idea to introduce this legislation? What precipitated this legislation needing to be introduced at this time? And would you be willing to submit any briefing notes from your department that would have perhaps recommended this move?
Thank you for the question. The idea of modernizing this law had been raised, I think, probably prior to my arrival there. But given the fact that the Quebec government, with the government of Manitoba as an intervener, were in a process with Air Canada, it was felt that we would wait until there was some kind of conclusion to that. And then it was felt that, and I supported this, that it would be an ideal opportunity for us to modernize the Act, to clarify it, in the hopes of avoiding litigation in the future. And as you know, this is what the Quebec government and the Manitoba government intended or expressed their intention to do as a result of Air Canada working with both those governments.
So would you have introduced this bill if Air Canada had not made a firm order for the C-Series aircraft?
We certainly would have waited to see if the process which was underway, which as you know had reached potentially the Supreme Court, we would have followed that process and certainly not done anything at that point.
So given that it's one of the first pieces of legislation that's been debated in this Parliament, why wasn't this need to modernize the legislation included in the election platform?
Well, I can't speak to that, but there are a lot of things that are in the election platform, and there are things that you will no doubt see us do in the course of the next 4 years that may not have been in the election platform. It's the nature of government that you can't put absolutely everything in that you're going to do during the next 4 years.
Thank you. So in response to my question during the debate, I questioned the Emerson report and ways that Air Canada could be supported that wouldn't affect jobs in Canada during the bill's second reading. The parliamentary secretary to the Minister of International Trade said, "We did not accept every suggestion. We picked the ones we thought were the best." And I guess what I'm wondering is what other options were considered before you decided this was the best one? And do the parliamentary secretary's comments mean that this exercise of consulting over and over on the Emerson report is a sham, and that you've actually made up your mind on what recommendations you're going to support and which ones you're not?
Well, in fact, I spoke at the Economic Club last Wednesday and outlined the plan ahead of us with respect to the Canada Transportation Act review undertaken by Mr. Emerson. And there are, as you know, some 60 recommendations in there. And I've outlined that on 5 different themes, one being safety, one being trade corridors, another one being green transportation, another one being our coasts in the north, and of course, safety and innovation. That we will be undertaking a number of critical stakeholder consultations this spring, this summer, and into the early fall. That's a separate process. With respect to this bill and modernizing it, as I've said repeatedly, the fact that Quebec and Manitoba, as a result of agreements that they negotiated with Air Canada, their decision to let, their intention to let the litigation go provided us with an opportunity to do 2 things. One is to clarify the Act to prevent the possibility or minimize the possibility of litigation in the future. But secondly, I said it in my opening remarks, we also want to allow Air Canada, which is an international carrier. It's competitive. It has 25,000 employees. It must also be allowed to compete in the marketplace, in a very competitive marketplace, not only for domestic flights but for international flights. And its competitors are not given specific restrictions with respect to things like where they must do their maintenance. So we wanted to level the playing field a little more for this company in the process, whilst also recognizing the need to continue maintenance in the 3 provinces that we mentioned, but with not the same constraints.
20 seconds.
I'll follow up on my first question, and just would you be willing to provide this committee with any recommendations that would have come from the department in terms of modernizing C-10 or modernizing the Act?
Well, I think the recommendations that came from the department have made their way into the Act as it is proposed, in which you are studying at this committee at the moment.
Thank you very much, Ms. Block. 6 minutes over to Mr. Hardy.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be splitting my time with some of my colleagues here. I actually have just one question. The arrangement with Air Canada was established for a reason, and it brought forward, aircraft that had previously been Crown assets, plus other things. And I guess the question is, are there any ongoing benefits that are conferred in that original agreement with Air Canada that give Air Canada now a competitive advantage over the other airlines in Canada?
Historically, the act that we're amending at the moment is an act that was instituted back in 1989 under the Conservative government of Prime Minister Mulroney. The decision was made to privatize Air Canada, which previously was with the government, and essentially 4 broad requirements, if you like, strings, remained attached to Air Canada. One is the requirements with respect to maintenance, which we're discussing now, but it also had 3 other obligations imposed upon it. One was that its headquarters had to be in the urban community of Montreal. Another one was that it had to implement the Official Languages Act on its flights. And the third one was, which actually applies to all Canadian airlines, was a limit of 25% on foreign ownership. Those 3 that I've just named to you, the last 3, its headquarters, official languages, and the 25% limit remain in place. They are not touched by this act. They are not apart from the 25% limit imposed on Air Canada's competitors.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Ministre.
Welcome, Minister. We all know that the company declared bankruptcy in 2012, and a lot of people lost their jobs. Could you explain to us how C10 will create new jobs, especially in Quebec and Manitoba? Thank you. I do have immense sympathy for those who lost their jobs with Avios in 2012. It's always regrettable when someone loses his or her job, no matter the field of endeavor. However, the situation that exists today, I believe, is promising in the sense that it will create jobs. As you know, Air Canada made a commitment to purchase 45 minimum, possibly 75 aircraft, but also to carry out the maintenance of these airplanes in Quebec. So as soon as these airplanes will begin to fly, their maintenance will be carried out in Quebec for at least 20 years. So I believe that this augurs well with regard to job creation. Secondly, with regard to Manitoba, as I mentioned, Air Canada and the Manitoban government have agreed to create a minimum of 150 jobs in Manitoba, with the possibility of creating other jobs in the future. So I recognize that it's not exactly the situation of 2012, but it is an energetic effort on the part of Air Canada to create jobs in Quebec and in Manitoba. And I would add that Ontario wasn't, or didn't rather, intervene in the litigation, the court action with the other two provinces, because there are already a lot of Air Canada jobs in the province of Ontario. So I believe that Air Canada made a commitment, a serious commitment, with regard to job creation in the province of Quebec and in that of Manitoba.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here this afternoon. Minister, airlines such as Air Canada, Delta, WestJet, United, etc., have a number of smaller aircraft that feed their hub airports, and then they have the larger aircraft that move people around the country and as well the globe. Over the past 10 years, has there been an increase, Minister, in the number of smaller aircraft operating in Canada with the growth of Porter, the creation of WestJet, Encore, and Air Canada Express? And with that said, would that growth in the number of smaller aircraft mean more maintenance jobs serving those airlines and as well as those aircraft?
I don't have, I'm afraid, specific numbers for you in terms of small aircraft and what they're defined as, how many passengers, what size to what size, but definitely there are more passengers today, definitely, and there are more flights today than there were 3 decades ago. It's definitely increasing. And so, yes, I would say to you that potentially there are more employment opportunities for maintenance with respect to the growing number of aircraft. Some of these maintenance jobs are done in different parts of the country, including places like Vancouver and Kelowna and other places that are that have some capability with respect to maintenance, and some of it is done abroad. But I would say that overall the picture is a good picture in terms of the increase in the number of people and the number of aircraft flying today in Canada, and as we predict for the coming decades.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Boulris for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to say that we're anxious to see the committee discuss the NDP's motion to extend its sittings with regard to Bill C-10, and we also hope that the committee will travel throughout the country to hear those affected by job losses, etc. Welcome, Minister. We have an unfortunate situation with C-10. It's going to feed the cynicism and the anger of a good portion of the population. We have a premier, or rather a prime minister, who was demonstrating on the Hill with those laid off by Avios. And we see that the Prime Minister has changed his position. And the party, the Liberal Party, said that the act with regard to Air Canada was not being respected, and it stated that we had to maintain these centres in Mississauga and Montreal and Winnipeg. You yourself made this statement, Mr. Garneau. The workers won before the Superior Court and the lower courts, and they're prepared to go to the Supreme Court. What are you saying to those 2,600 families who risk losing their livelihood? Yes, you're right. I made these statements in 2012, and unfortunately, nothing was done by the government in power at the time. Since then, the situation has evolved, and we're 4 years later today. I know that there are employees who unfortunately lost their jobs and didn't have the opportunity to be rehired by other companies. However, it was the case for some of these workers. But we have a different reality in 2016. There were agreements negotiated between Air Canada and the government of Quebec and the government of Manitoba, and they decided to abandon their court challenge because they deemed that the situation will improve, and the agreement that they plan on signing on to officially with Air Canada, they believe will create new jobs, long-term jobs. So I believe that the fact that Quebec and Manitoba decided to accept with Air Canada these agreements that they discussed gives us, I believe, the opportunity to clarify the act. What I find unfortunate in the answer you're providing is that you're playing off the production sector against the maintenance sector, and those people are entitled to continue to work. They have to continue to work. We have to continue to overhaul and maintain our planes while retaining our jobs here. Bill C-10 has no requirement as to the type of activity to maintain in the country, the volume of the activity, or the number of jobs. It's a blank check that you're giving to Air Canada with the pretext of giving them flexibility, saying do what you want when you want. How many jobs in overhaul and maintenance will be maintained in Canada after the passage of C-10? I'm not playing off production against maintenance of aircrafts in Canada. I stated that Air Canada committed to carrying out the maintenance of the 45 and let's hope 75 C-Series airplanes. And this is maintenance, it's not production. Production, the production that's done in Mirabel to build the C-Series, and I do hope that we're going to build hundreds and hundreds of this aircraft. Well, they're not involved in this discussion today. The issue is to create maintenance jobs for the 45 to 75 aircraft in Quebec and to provide a minimum of 150 jobs in Manitoba. Would you prepared to improve upon Bill C-10 with amendments that might bring into play requirements as far as job creation or the maintenance of jobs in Quebec for the maintenance and operational needs of aircraft in Canada? We tabled our bill. It's here before you. It's up to you, the committee, to decide. You are an independent committee in dealing with this issue, so I won't speak for the committee. I have a minute and a half remaining. Perfect. In the document of Transport Canada with regard to changes to the Act, it is stated that Quebec expects that there will be the creation of a Centre of Excellence. It's stated that this Centre of Excellence should create jobs. When I read this, and I come from the union world, well, I say these are nice intentions, but there's no guarantee and there's no number, no target. These are jobs that, for the moment, are fictional. And these aircraft will perhaps wait several years before they require maintenance work. So we're losing 2,600 jobs, and we're hoping that new jobs will perhaps be created. But we have no idea of the number. It's not very reassuring for a government that says that it wants to participate in job creation. Having studied this file and having had the opportunity to see what Air Canada intends to do, and has clearly intended it is planning on doing in Quebec and Manitoba. I'm confident that these jobs will be created in Manitoba. It'll start in 2017. It'll start a little later in Quebec, based upon when these planes will be delivered. But it'll be for at least 20 years beyond that. You are aware that these job losses, 2,600, are illegal. They were illegal job losses. And the statistics you're providing today will simply, and the changes you're announcing today will simply render legal the job losses and the layoffs that were illegal back in time.
The minister wants to give a very fast answer to that question, otherwise the
Juste
time
pour
is
dire,
up.
c'est pour ça qu'on a attendu au point où le Québec et le Maine.
We were waiting to see Quebec and Manitoba decide if they would be ready to drop the challenge.
Hold for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Je veux tout d'abord vous remercier, M. Garneau, pour votre visite.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Garneau, for your visit to Lac-Mégantic last week. It was greatly appreciated by most of the people of Lac-Mégantic. I'd like to move on now directly to C10, and I'd like to come back to what you just stated with regard to the government of Quebec. The Minister of the Economy of Quebec had to go to a press conference to state that the changes might hinder the creation of the Centre of Excellence. Did you talk to Ms. Anglade? I didn't talk to Ms. Anglade. My chief of staff talked to her. Following upon this press conference and these statements, I believe that Ms. Anglade will be making a submission before this committee. So I will leave it up to her. She will have the opportunity to express herself. If I understood correctly, she will be sending something to the committee. But Ms. Anglade and myself are on the same wavelength. We understand the situation. There's a process underway here in Canada's Parliament pertaining to C10. There are a lot of steps and stages. It's not something that after a second reading becomes law automatically. Proof of that is that we're here sitting in this committee today. You will be hearing witnesses, and then the bill will have to be referred back to the House of Commons for third reading. I understand, Mr. Garneau, what the process is, but it's rare that the government of Quebec at this stage intervenes. Clearly, in the press conference, it said, listen, stop. You're going to hinder our discussions because the agreement was on condition that there would be a final agreement. There was never agreement. But from the beginning, you've constantly said that there's an agreement between Air Canada and the government of Quebec. But I didn't see this agreement. The government of Quebec hasn't seen it. It hasn't yet been ratified. So why this rush? Why are you imposing this? Well, as I mentioned, the government of Quebec plans on dropping the litigation on the basis of an agreement with the government of Canada. We believe that all this will be respected and followed through. The parliamentary process requires time. This has been undertaken. We will pursue this process for a certain amount of time. It's guaranteed. So we're on the same wavelength with Madame Anglade. But what the government of Quebec says is that with the tabling of this bill, you're removing from them their power in negotiating with the government of Canada, because there will be no longer any levers for the province, no legal levers, no ability to challenge. Are you making a serious commitment with regard to jobs? We want a serious commitment from Air Canada. I'm worried because they didn't even respect the law. So what are you basing yourself on to consider that their engagement, their commitment is a serious one, that of Air Canada? I believe that my discussions lead me to believe that this is very serious. The discussions are serious and the commitment is firm. But you have no written commitment from Air Canada. You don't have a letter of agreement that you could table with the members of this committee in order for us to be, we too, reassured as to the seriousness of this commitment. We're talking about a bill that you would like to see adopted quickly because it's the first time that there's a time limit. It's the first time that your government is calling upon this measure for a bill that's quite short. We don't understand why it's urgent. The government of Quebec is saying it's not the right time to do this, and we have nothing else to look at, just the bill. You've said that the recommendations from Transport Canada are included in the bill. There's just one page. There aren't many recommendations in this bill, Mr. Garneau. Allow me to clarify something for you, Mr. Berthold. There is no agreement between us and Air Canada. The agreement is between Air Canada and the government of Quebec, and between Air Canada and the government of Manitoba. So that must be clear. Well, I'm happy to hear this. I wanted this to be clearly outlined because my next question is, was there an agreement with Air Canada with regard to this bill? It must be a misunderstanding on the part of some, but there's no agreement between us and Air Canada. Air Canada is a company that operates independently, and its relations are with the provinces. So my question is even more relevant. You stated earlier that the idea was brought up before you arrived in your portfolio, but who brought the idea back in order for you to go forward with C-10, and who suggested that we move so quickly? These are discussions that took place between Air Canada and Quebec and Air Canada and Manitoba. That's what brought it back to the fore. So you're saying that it's an agreement between the government of Quebec and Air Canada. So these discussions brought this back to the fore. So there's someone in your entourage or in Transport Canada who said, oh, they're discussing these issues now, so it would be a good idea to help them. And we're going to announce right away that we're going to remove these requirements for Air Canada. What we saw, what we observed, is that there were discussions between Air Canada and those two provinces. And as I mentioned, within our department, for a long time, there was a desire to clarify the act, the legislation in place, to minimize the possibility of litigation in the future. So it was becoming opportune to intervene based on the decisions taken vis-à-vis the intentions of Quebec and Manitoba.
Thank you, Mr. Garneau. Sufficient time for another round, Mr. Sican?
Just have two quick questions. In regards to the aerospace industry, are we the only country that stipulates or requires a carrier to have their operation set somewhere?
It's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. Certainly, we did have these specific strings attached to Air Canada for almost 30 years, and they're still officially attached. I'll turn to my colleagues to know. I don't know whether other countries have similar. There are state-run airlines in other countries, but in terms of independent carriers, I don't know the answer to that question. I suspect it's probably unusual. Yes, please. May I ask my Associate Deputy Minister to speak on this?
I'd be pleased to. We're not aware of any other country who has similar requirements. We would be happy to look and to return with that information to the committee.
Thank you.
And I think I heard you say, Minister, that Air Canada employs 25,000 people? Okay, so
That's correct.
Potentially, that's the number of people that could be at risk if that company fails to be competitive on the global stage.
There's no question that the airline world is extremely competitive, and Air Canada has to compete out there with everybody else. So it's a big picture, and Air Canada maintenance activities are a significant portion of its fiscal or financial obligations. It obviously has to maintain the airplanes so that they remain safe and continue to provide all the flights that it advertises. So how they do the maintenance and where they do the maintenance is a factor that all airlines consider. And certainly in Canada at the moment, Air Canada is the only one who has the constraints of Bill C-10.
Thank you, sir. Madam Chair, I'll be splitting my time.
Mr. Fraser?
Thank you very much, Minister, for joining us today. Building on the theme of Air Canada's competitiveness, the CTA review indicated that in a major sort of international market, which is very competitive, that's the direction Air Canada would need to go to experience growth. Do you agree that we do need to reach into the international markets, and is labor a relevant factor in gauging the competitiveness of Air Canada?
Certainly, Air Canada operates not only domestically but internationally, and for it to grow, it has to continue to build those markets, and there are opportunities for it to build markets internationally. With respect to the question of labor, if you could tell me a little bit more what you meant.
Sure. It's really, it seems to me that under the existing legislation, the locations that you can recruit the labor force in are restricted. And I'm wondering if you can expand on the impact that restrictive nature has on Air Canada's competitiveness to branch out into these new markets.
It's a good question. It's one I would have to get back to you on. I think it's a big, serious question, and I don't have the answer at my fingertips, but we'll look into that.
Sure. Just sort of turning the page a bit, legislation is obviously one tool that's available to encourage growth, but I don't believe it's the only one. Could you highlight potentially some other things that Air Canada could explore to experience growth?
Well, this allows me to bring up the fact that the CTA review report, which was tabled on the 25th of February, actually makes certain suggestions which it says the government may wish to look at. One issue, for example, which I'll bring up as an example, is increasing foreign ownership to 49%. The argument that is brought forward by the CTA review is that this would encourage the creation of other companies to come into the market and would make the whole business more competitive. So we're for the consumer. So we're going to be looking at those and all the other recommendations related to air passenger transport that are contained in the CTA report during the course of the spring, summer, and fall.
Thank you very much. If there's time left, I'm happy to yield to
Mr. Iacono, you have 1 minute and 15 seconds.
Ministre, comment peut-on...
Minister, in your view, how can we reconcile the protection of Canadian jobs while at the same time allowing Air Canada to modernize itself and to remain competitive on the North American market? Well, that's the dilemma that we face. And for Air Canada, that's clearly the situation. Air Canada had certain requirements, very precise requirements under the previous Act, and C-10, as it presently exists, would change things. In '89, when Mr. Mulroney's government privatized Air Canada, it was said, go ahead, compete in the world. Compete worldwide against other airline companies. We're giving you your independence. However, you must satisfy 4 requirements, among them that of carrying out the maintenance of your aircraft in 3 cities, specific cities. So beyond clarifying the Act, we're recognizing here that Air Canada must compete in a world that is ferociously competitive, and we must allow it a greater room to maneuver with regard to its decisions pertaining to maintenance.
Ms. Watts for 6 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here again. I just need some clarification on a couple of things. Now, you're saying that the bill's introduced based on the litigation between Air Canada and the provinces, and thus the bill's introduced to end that litigation.
It's introduced as a result of us getting an indication that the Quebec government and the Manitoba government, which was an intervener, said very clearly that they intended to drop their litigation with Air Canada.
So it was based on the provinces. So I understand. So I need to understand then, because I know that there were several meetings that you, your staff, and the PMO had with Air Canada. I mean, since December the 15th, 9 meetings. 2 days before you had announced the this Air Canada Public Participation Act, another meeting. So in those meetings, was this specific act discussed?
I did not meet with Air Canada or discuss this matter.
Okay, so your staff would have then, I'm assuming?
You'd have to show me what you're referring to in terms of meetings, and we would look at what you say that there were a number of meetings. We'd have to look at that.
Sure, yeah, December 5th, January 8th, January 22nd, January 27th, February the 3rd, and then February 15th, 2 days before this was announced. So I'm just trying to understand in terms of coming to an agreement and resolving things, if it's based on what the province and future litigation, I'm wondering if we've got some information here and some briefing notes or whatever it is that this committee could have a look at in terms of how that supports the bill and how Air Canada was involved in that process.
If you would give us the dates of that you mentioned formally, but I can tell you that I did not meet with, I've met with Air Canada to discuss other things, but I have not met with Air Canada myself to discuss
this act. Okay. I'll turn my balance of my time to Kelly.
Oh, okay, thank you. So, Minister, on the one hand, you stated that the law needed to be modernized in order to ensure that this carrier would be able to compete in a progressive global marketplace. And yet, just in answer to one of your colleagues' questions, you stated that you didn't have any idea what the economic benefits to Air Canada would be. Again, what was the compelling argument that was brought forward to you to introduce this bill to change the Air Canada Public Participation Act now, if you don't actually know what the economic benefits to Air Canada will be as a result?
Let me be clear again. The reason that we are modifying this law is, one, we want to avoid litigation in the future. Secondly, we recognize that Air Canada has to operate in a very competitive environment, and therefore we wanted to allow it a greater margin of maneuver. I'm not sure about the economic benefit to Air Canada argument that you're bringing up. Could you explain that to me?
Well, I believe my colleague across the way asked what sort of economic benefits there would be to Air Canada. How would this change actually?
Let me be a little more explicit on that. Well, you know, a company that operates hundreds of airplanes has to maintain them. Those are considerable costs. If we're to make sure that Canadians feel that when they get on an Air Canada plane it's safe, there are considerable costs involved with making sure that those airplanes are safe. So those are considerable costs for a large company like Air Canada. If it has more leeway in deciding where it's going to do that maintenance, I think that allows it to achieve a more optimum, if you like, financial situation, as opposed to being constrained to be in specific locations. I hope you understand what I was trying to say.
Minute and 15 seconds.
I guess, could you tell us what the costs are currently?
No, I can't tell you what the costs are now, but I can say that if a company is given the leeway, like WestJet is, or Porter, or Transat, or any other company that operates in Canada, of going out and saying, look, I need this aircraft maintained, and everybody who wants to maintain it can come out and bid for it, they can usually get the best possible deal financially, rather than to be in a situation where you have to go with a particular, where you are more constrained in terms of your choices.
30 seconds.
Okay. Just one. C'est pas inquiétant, Monsieur Garneau?
Isn't worrisome, Mr. Garneau, as Minister of Transport, what you've just stated? Doing the maintenance of airplanes in Canada isn't competitive. Is that not worrisome for our country? I'm not the one who said that. Yes, but you're saying that we're going to leave it up to the market. But the underlying message is that the requirements for Air Canada are such that Air Canada isn't the best. Allow me to reassure you. Our air carriers know that their future depends critically on the quality of the aircraft maintenance. So as you perhaps were suggesting, it's not a matter of simply finding the cheapest product. The reputation is what counts. When there's an air accident for companies, there are serious consequences. So I'm very confident that, first and foremost, there is expertise here throughout Canada for maintenance, and Air Canada is very aware of this.
Over to Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Minister. Minister, what might some of the impacts be on Air Canada, its employees, the Canadian travelers, if the legislation is not updated to reflect today's market realities?
Well, I make no secret of the fact that Air Canada and its public, because they've made it public in the past, have not been overly pleased with the fact that they had specific constraints imposed upon them, and they often invoked the fact that this did not allow them to be as competitive. And obviously, a company, the better it is doing financially, is the more services it can offer, the more it can expand. This is, I make no secret of the fact that also Air Canada has in the past spoken about some of its other obligations that remain there and wish that they didn't, but those have not been changed. But with respect to the issue of maintenance, which is a considerable cost for a company, they have wanted for a long time to change things, and if they have that leeway, I believe that it helps their bottom line and ultimately helps the consumer. But I can't give you specific numbers at this point.
Thank you, Minister. Second question, if I may, Madam Chair. Minister, in your view, the Mulroney government back a few decades ago, I guess it would be, privatized Air Canada. Was it the right thing to do? And how does this bill, C-10, fit into this logically?
Well, in hindsight, and hindsight is 2020, I think that ultimately it is, in principle, a good thing to privatize certain companies. However, in a sense, the Mulroney government only went halfway. They didn't. They couldn't quite make the break. I don't know if it was because there was some sentimental attachment to Air Canada or some political factors that came into it, but they said, "You're on your own, but you must do this." I think that if you're going to privatize a government-run organization, I think you wait until you're ready to go the whole way. And so in that sense, it's something that perhaps is a lesson for us in terms of any potential decision in the future for Canada to privatize anything.
Great, thank you.
Vous avez parlé tout à l'heure de...
Earlier, you talked about 4 requirements flowing from the privatization of Air Canada. Might you indicate to us if the carrier did indeed respect these requirements? Well, of course, we're aware of the history with regard to maintenance work, and as for the 3 others, its headquarters is still in Montreal. With regard to the matter of official languages, the Commissioner for Official Languages writes reports regularly with regard to the respect or non-respect of the needs for Air Canada with regard to compliance with the Official Languages Act. And the Commissioner criticized at times and continues to be vigilant in this regard. So Air Canada was criticized in the past with regard to official languages. And the third element, with regard to foreign ownership, well, that hasn't changed since the beginning. It is not an issue at present with Air Canada, and it's the same need that's in place as is the case for all the other airlines, 25% maximum at present.
Seconds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have to go back to my first question because you gave me a different answer. I was talking about the benefits that Air Canada got when it was set up. It had aircraft given to it, route rights, slots at major international airports. The aircraft are long gone, of course, but the others were worth a considerable amount of money, especially for an air company just starting out. Are there ongoing benefits from that original deal that give Air Canada an advantage over its competitors?
Thank you for the question, and I'll attempt to respond to the benefits. The ACPA was put in place as a framework for the privatization of Air Canada to move it from a Crown corporation to a viable and competitive private entity, and that has occurred while Air Canada has maintained aircraft activity in Canada, and the purpose of the initial privatization has led to, 30 years later, an air carrier that is competitive, but that is subject to requirements under the current ACPA that are not made applicable to its competitors, either domestically or internationally. So while it has achieved the benefits of the ACPA, this is an obligation that could impact on its competitiveness going forward.
I'm sorry, it's still not the answer. Are they getting an advantage that the other airlines are not getting from the original deal, i.e. the international routes and the access to those other airports?
Short answer, if possible.
Canada has a very competitive air sector policy which relies on competition and competition in its international routes, and where possible open access for competitors to provide the best service level and costs for travelers and for Canadians. So in that sense, it does not have a benefit from as a residual from the privatization.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Berthold.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Minister, I'm delighted to be able to pursue our conversation because earlier you suggested that I had suggested that perhaps there was a lesser quality with regard to the maintenance of Air Canada aircraft, but I was inspired when I said that by a statement made here in the House of Commons. Allow me to quote the statement you made. Whereas we're refusing to invest in what made this country strong, and we're endangering thousands of traveling Canadians who travel every day risking their lives because of lower maintenance levels, it's improper. It's Mr. Justin Trudeau who made this statement on the Hill before the AVS workers. So I was inspired. I simply wanted to share with you what inspired me, and this is why I did have some fears with regard to a lesser quality of maintenance services. From what I understand, you're not impressed by this. Well, I would say that the situation has changed since 2012. What changed? Well, we didn't know what was going to happen, but today the picture is clear. What changed exactly? What has changed precisely since 2012? Because we have the same litigation, the same case before the courts, the same workers who are worried, and the government of Quebec is saying don't budge. The government of Quebec doesn't want the act to change. I'm not in agreement with your interpretation of what the Quebec government wants and is telling us. The government of Quebec is very aware of the fact that we're all moving forward in this file. It indicated clearly that it intends to drop the litigation once Air Canada signs on with this contract. And I believe that Ms. Anglade was invited. I believe it's the case. She's been invited, has she not, to appear before the committee? She's on the list of witnesses, Madam Chair. So whether she appears here or not, I believe she will be forwarding something to the committee. So I would encourage you, perhaps, to put the question to Ms. Anglade. But I'm confident that Ms. Anglade understands fully that we have decided to proceed with amendments to the Act because we are confident as far as the intent of the government of Quebec is concerned, and this has been waiting for some time, as I outlined. I simply would quote what Ms. Anglade said. What we want is that maintenance be maintained in Quebec generally. With the changes proposed, we don't want this to hinder the agreement we have with Air Canada and the fact that we're before the courts. And before the courts, the correspondence received by the Supreme Court is that, and this comes from the applicant, and there's been an agreement between the parties to postpone the decision with regard to the authorization to appeal. So all that's been agreed to is to put off the decision to appeal. So with regard to Ms. Anglade, I think it would be appropriate that you communicate with the government of Quebec to see exactly what they're expecting from us here in Ottawa, because we wouldn't want to hinder the implementation of these maintenance centres. You're proud of them. We are too. We want this to happen here, but we wouldn't want to act too quickly and in this way hinder the establishment of these centres. In my mind, there's no confusion between our position and the measures we're taking here vis-à-vis C10. And I believe that Ms. Anglade will outline all of this, and you will see that both of us are on the same wavelength. Coming back to something you suggested at the beginning, you mentioned the quality of maintenance. You know that this is regulated in Canada. It's part of our responsibilities. It's Mr. Trudeau who mentioned the danger with regard to the quality of maintenance work, Mr. Garneau. But I'm here simply to tell you that this is regulated. It's one of the first requirements and obligations of Transport Canada.
Minister, you mentioned a few times that the reason for the introduction of this amendment to ACPA was to ensure that we would avoid litigation in the future. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us if you've thought about what may be required, perhaps future amendments to ensure that stakeholders could take legal action should Air Canada not fulfill its commitments concerning the promised centres of excellence. What recourse will stakeholders have if commitments made in terms of a centre of excellence? What recourse will stakeholders have if those aren't met?
Well, I think that the new law is clearer than the previous one because there was some difference of opinion, as you know, between the parties that went to court. And I think that what we really wanted to do was to make it much clearer. I believe it is clearer now. And I say that with respect to the new content of the law, I'm quite confident that there will not be any misinterpretation of what that says. I think it is clear. As you know, previously, some of the disagreement with respect to what was intended by it had to do with the definition of maintenance, and I think we've made that clearer in this this new version of C10.
You have 30 seconds.
I just want to point out, my colleague asked about meetings with Air Canada. If you go to the lobbying registry, it's all registered there, who meets with who, and so that would be where we understood that there were meetings between yourself and Air Canada or lobbyists from Air Canada and other members of your
And I'm very much
staff.
aware of that, Ms. Block, and we meet with Air Canada all the time, and we meet with the whole transport sector all the time. It doesn't necessarily reflect what we're there to meet. There are a whole bunch of issues, so you're asking for specifics related to this, so allow us to get back. But I will turn it over to my ADM on the, if you like, on the ministry side.
Sorry, the time is up. Thank you very much today and enlightening the committee on a variety of the challenges facing C10, and we appreciate very much Mr. Garneau and your officials for being here today. We will suspend for 2 minutes until we get hooked up for our teleconference next.
Thank you.
Please call the meeting back to order. The members could take their seats, please. And we have with us now via teleconferencing Mike Trethewey, the Chief Economist and Chief Strategy Officer, Intervistas Consulting Group, by video conference from Vancouver, British Columbia. Welcome. And Peter Wallace, President and Chief Executive Officer, Van Horn Institute, Calgary, Alberta. Welcome, gentlemen, to both of you. Mr. Trethewey, would you like to commence?
Yes. My name is Mike Trethewey. I'm Chief Economist and Chief Strategy Officer of Intervistas Consulting. We're a Canadian-founded aviation, transportation, and tourism firm. We now have offices in Canada, the United States, Europe, and Latin America. We employ about 90 people. We're an important services export for Canada. I have a PhD in economics. I taught for 14 years in the transportation faculty at the University of British Columbia, and I continue to have an adjunct position there. I like to disclose any clients I have where there may be a conflict that might be perceived. I don't think I have a conflict. Air Canada is a past client, but so is WestJet and Air Transat and Porter Airlines, almost every airport authority in Canada, the Competition Bureau, Transport Canada, Transportation Agency. So we've worked broadly throughout the sector, and I think I bring a balanced perspective. I only have a few opening remarks. I'm happy to address any questions. I was asked to appear. I did not solicit an appearance. First of all, I note that there's been 30 years since the legislation was introduced, and for me that's interesting because in that period of time, not only did I have, or my wife more technically had a child, but I've also got grandchildren now, so we're actually 2 generations past this legislation. And I make that point because the world in aviation is really different. We no longer see government-owned airlines in any meaningful way like we did 30 years ago. And especially important is in the maintenance industry. This industry today is very unlike the maintenance industry of 30 years ago. This industry has evolved into huge economies of scale and specialization. To give an example, Air Canada is currently re-equipping with 787s. They're wonderful aircraft. They have 29 on order. I think they already have 17 delivered. When you project ahead, when they're going to have heavy maintenance that'll have to be done to repair and overhaul these aircraft, there's going to be an intensive period of about 3 years replicating the current flow-in of aircraft into their fleet right now. So going out 10 years and 20 years, you're going to have these waves of 3 years where there's going to be intensive maintenance. It'll need dedicated 787 specialists and parts and so forth. And then there'll be years where there'll be nothing to do. And what's happened throughout the world is that maintenance is now specialized. You get a specialist in 787, well, a range of specialists in 787 maintenance that they can even the flow out. They'll do Air Canada 10 years from now, and that'll be followed by Delta Airlines or somebody else. And I view this legislation as perplexing in some ways. I'm not sure why we continue to take a carrier that 2 generations ago happened to have been owned by the government and have different restrictions on them than airlines that have emerged in that period of time. But this is a win-win situation in that this legislation, I think, will allow Air Canada to have greater competition and choices for its maintenance. If you're concerned about safety, then focus on safety regulation. Don't do it by forcing a buying solution on one particular carrier. But the other win is in Canada, this legislation actually will create incentives to build Canadian-based and expand Canadian-based maintenance. I'm particularly enthused about the recent Air Canada order for the CS-300 aircraft. I personally believe this is a game-changing aircraft that just hit the market at the wrong time, and we have seen in the last few weeks here 2 major orders being placed, one of which is Air Canada, but the largest order is Delta, which is the 3rd largest airline in the world, and they're going to be shopping maintenance on that. And I think that this legislation will create the incentives for building a Bombardier aircraft type maintenance operation in Canada. I don't see a downside from this legislation. If anything, it perhaps doesn't go far enough in leveling the playing field between carriers in Canada. And I'll stop my remarks here and be happy to answer any questions you have after Peter's comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Strathwaite. Mr. Wallace?
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. My name is Peter Wallace. I'm the president of the Van Horn Institute, which is a transportation institute based at the University of Calgary. The institute works very closely with industry, with governments, and other stakeholders to develop programs in education, the post-secondary and the secondary school level in transportation, supply chain, and logistics. We also do a large degree of public policy research in these fields, and it could include anything from high-speed, high-frequency rail to aviation policy to the movement of Western Canadian bitumen by rail from Fort McMurray to Valdez via a combination of both rail and pipeline. A bit of information about myself. I have studied aviation law for a number of years. Have a degree from the University of London in aviation law. I've worked for the Canadian Transport Commission as a legal counsel in all modes of transport. I was seconded as Chief of Staff to 2 federal ministers of transport. I worked for Pacific Western Airlines, which subsequently became Canadian Airlines, which in turn acquired CP Air and Wardair to form the major airline Canadian Airlines. My responsibilities included government relations, regulatory affairs, public affairs, and security. And government affairs included working on international aviation bilaterals with the Government of Canada. I've had the honor to serve on the board of the Calgary Airport Authority, 5 years as chair, and I'm now currently on the board of CATSA. With respect to this legislation, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be here with you. I was asked to appear, and I should, as Mike has, indicate that as members of the Van Horn Institute, we have Air Canada, WestJet, a number of other transportation carriers, airport authorities. opportunity, though, to give you some views on this legislation. Is a positive one. As I read this legislation, it is really one step to releasing Air Canada from being bound to be able to participate as other carriers can in the world economy, basically unfettered without any restriction. When you look at the Emerson report, which I'm sure will be before this committee shortly, Emerson was very clear that our international airlines must have the freedom to be able to create supply chains in and out of Canada that allow it to compete with the biggest and the best in the world. And to be able to do so, they have to be able to control their costs. Costs are one of the main components that any airline has that must address, and indeed costs are very much tied up in the maintenance. Maintenance costs are around 10 to 15% of any airline's cost structure. So when I look at this legislation, I'm looking very carefully to see the degree of fettering, if that's the correct word, the degree of holding Air Canada back from being a truly competitive air carrier on the world stage, which I think is something we should all be searching for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wallace. We will start now with the committee questioning, and 6 minutes with Ms. Block.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you as well for joining us today. I guess I want to start off with a question that was asked of one of Minister Garneau's department staff, and it was about the residual benefits, if any, that Air Canada may have from its legacy status. And I'm wondering if, Mr. Trethewey, you might be able to comment on that. Do they continue to have any residual benefits as a legacy, from their legacy status?
Yeah, perhaps I could take a quick run at that one. Thanks for the question. I think at the outset there were significant legacy benefits. They were, I think, identified by one of the honourable members. You know, these benefits including basically unfettered aircraft, balance sheet completely free of debt, and indeed some of the proceeds coming from the offering to Canadians of those shares. I think all of that is behind us now, and I don't see any residual benefits that might be identified from that particular venture many years back. I think it was in the the Mulroney government.
Okay, well, perhaps we could drill down a little bit and talk about the weekly slots that Air Canada has at a number of major airports. Do you not see that as a residual benefit?
When I worked with Canadian Airlines, we actually worked with Air Canada at the recommendation of the Honourable John Crosbie to sit down and try and determine which carrier would be the best on behalf of the country, which carrier would be the best operator of services into different countries in the world. And we were able to do that, and so the slots basically continued from that particular initiative. So I'm not entirely sure that I would say that there's any real residual other than what was agreed upon at that time.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Trethewey?
By the comment?
Yes.
Yeah, so first of all, slots are complicated. Often if you have a major carrier at an airport, they're adding a flight actually creates more connectivity than a totally new carrier. And so that's why most airports in the slot rules are any new slots, half the slots go to the incumbent because of the benefits there, then half go to new entrants into the market to create competitive access. Now, we have to remember that, Air Canada did go through bankruptcy, and in that process, they reduced service at Toronto, which opened a lot of slots. In fact, that was the time when WestJet made its major move from Hamilton. They still have a presence in Hamilton, but they developed a major operation at Pearson Airport because they utilized slots freed up. The slots issue also, there's other aspects. So if we look look at Toronto Island, for example, Porter Airlines there has got the overwhelming majority of slots. Any new slots that become available, Air Canada presumably would get access to half, but an agreement between the federal government, the city, and the Port Authority has strictly limited the number of operations at the island, and Porter got those slots originally. I believe Air Canada, I can't speak for Air Canada, but my understanding is that they would actually like to get in there. If I just make one last comment about the previous question, as an economist, we always think in terms of things like depreciation rates and so forth, and I'd suggest that 30 years, if there were any benefits to Air Canada, probably fully depreciated, and any benefits to their shareholders from the aircraft or whatever, those aircraft has already been observed are long gone, and Air Canada went through bankruptcy, so those shareholders, the original shareholders, frittered away their benefits, shall we say. They're long gone. I think we have to look at the way the world is today.
Thank you very much. I do want to follow up on another comment that was made by you, Mr. Wallace, in regards to the Emerson report. And you talked about the numerous recommendations that are in the Emerson report. I think there are 66 recommendations for the air sector, and I'm wondering, I would make the observation that this measure of amending the Act was not recommended by Air Canada or any other carrier for that matter. And you also suggested that this Act, C-10, doesn't go far enough in leveling the playing field for air carriers in Canada in general. So I guess I would like you to have an opportunity to comment on the fact that Air Canada didn't make this recommendation of something that would help them become more competitive, and what you meant by this amendment not going far enough.
No, well, thank you very much for the question. I think what I was saying was that this particular amendment, given a wide reading, would allow Air Canada to enter into that wider competitive environment which it's going to find itself in when it comes to having to seek out the best possible price for, as Mike has talked about, the maintenance of its airframes, the maintenance of the very intricate and delicate avionics that come with all of these new generation equipment, including the Bombardier series of airplanes. That's really to what I was referring, and I think if and you're going to have to hear from Air Canada on this as to how they plan to work within the clause as it's been revised and added to ensure that it can remain competitive, but at the same time deal with the specific provisions that one might say could be construed as an encumbrance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wallace. On to Mr. Badaway for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being with us this afternoon. Gentlemen, how do most airlines handle their maintenance? Is it done in-house, or are there centers of excellence where one type of aircraft will work on?
Am I connected?
You are.
Can you hear me? Thank you. So I think there's a dichotomy. What we call the legacy carriers, many of them continue to do their maintenance in-house, and carriers that have been newly created in the 30 years almost never do their maintenance in-house. They seek a more efficient, specialized solution. But even among the legacy carriers, we're actually seeing a strong movement to contracting out, especially the heavy maintenance. So Qantas, for example, Australia is a bit smaller country than Canada, but geographically it's similar. It's just we're colder and we're tipped on. Australia's kind of tipped on its side. Most of the activity is just on the East Coast there. Qantas now does almost all of its heavy maintenance through outsourcing, some of that in Australia and some of it elsewhere.
Hey, Madam Chair, just to follow up on that question and to dig a bit deeper, what type of maintenance is usually done by the airline today, and what type is contracted out, in particular, to a center of excellence?
Well, typically heavy maintenance is one that'll be contracted out. Line maintenance, so things that come up flight to flight, often that will be done even by the newly created carriers, by their own maintenance staff. there are some, I mean, this is a complex area, and one of the big issues is inventories of spare parts. It's very expensive for an airline like WestJet or Air Canada, given the hundreds of points that they fly to keep a complete set of spare parts. And that's one of the reasons why this industry has evolved. We're seeing more and more contracting out, even these days, of some of the line maintenance, simply because if you contract out all the line maintenance at one airport for a particular aircraft type, you probably will have the needed trained staff as well as the spare parts.
Thank you. And finally, how does Air Canada's maintenance operations and their programs actually compare to other competitors throughout North America?
I don't have any benchmarking information to share. No.
Peter?
I don't have any information on that either. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Madam Chair, I'm going to pass it on to Mr. Iacona.
Okay.
Thank you. My question can be addressed to both individuals. Thank you for being here today. According to media reports, work previously done for Air Canada by Avios is now split among companies in Quebec, United States, Israel, and Singapore. According to you, is the aircraft maintenance sector growing in Canada? Why or why not?
Well, there are pockets of maintenance expertise in Canada, which have grown and waxed and waned over the years. To answer your question, is whether it is actually growing or not, I really don't think I can give you any information that would be of value.
Mr. Mike?
Yes, so again, this is a really complicated issue. There are aspects of maintenance that have grown in Canada and other aspects that haven't. The sense I have overall is that we used to be number 3 in the world in terms of aerospace, including aircraft production, that we're likely around number 5 at this point. One of the complications in this is a big aspect of aircraft maintenance is engines. And engines today are incredibly reliable, so reliable that we have almost no aircraft flying that have more than 2 engines. And if you go back 30 years ago, most of the intercontinental aircraft had 3 or 4 engines. Today they're 777s, they're 787s, they're A330s, and so forth. And these are all 2-engine aircraft. The A340 is the one exception, and the 747-8. So as engines have become more reliable, maintenance throughout the world has actually been reduced because we have fewer, much more reliable aircraft, and the demand then overall for maintenance. So the overall sense that I have is that we have declined somewhat of that. That's largely in terms of aircraft production. Starting to come back now as the CS series takes orders.
45 seconds remaining.
Is the only way to protect maintenance jobs by legislation? And what else can be done to encourage companies like Air Canada to perform maintenance in our country?
I don't think you can protect by legislation. So, go ahead, Peter.
No, I was just simply going to say that I don't think you protect jobs by by legislation. I think, like in any marketplace, companies have to step up and show value. And by doing so, you create centers of excellence, with the Bombardier C-Series being built in Montreal and with the orders that appear to be starting to be flowing in as a result of the Air Canada and the Delta orders. It seems clear to me that centers of excellence in maintenance of that particular equipment, both the avionics and indeed the airframes, is not a sure bet, but it's a good opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much.
Tax incentives on investments required are important.
Okay, thank you.
Tax incentives for the type of equipment, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Stratton. Maybe you can get your point on someone else's questions. Mr. Boulris, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to both our guests for being with us today. At the outset, I would like to underscore some aspects of this bill, which in fact will authorize the loss of 2,600 jobs in the country. It has just legalized this, and it makes a vague promise to perhaps have a center of excellence one day for the maintenance of 45 C-Series aircraft if they're really purchased by Air Canada. Just to be clear, we're not talking about the same issue. In 2012, just before Avias went bankrupt, it was 300 planes per year that were maintained by qualified personnel in the area of Montreal. And perhaps the promise is that 45 planes will be able to be maintained there in the future. My question to our witnesses today is the following. There is some concern. People are worried with regard to the quality of the work that will be done in other countries. In a document produced by Industry Canada, it is stated that Canadian airline builders take care of the initial higher costs to get into the workplace and the world market, but they accept greater risks. And that's where an alarm bell is going off. Do you know what type of risks we're talking about? What is being put at risk in accepting in world production chains and world supply chains? What does this represent as a risk in your view?
Venture a start to the answer, and I think I'd just like to point out to the honourable member that when we're talking about sending this work offshore, we're talking about sending it to companies like Air France Industries, to Airbus, to Boeing, to British Airways Engineering, GE Aviation, Hong Kong Aircraft Engineering, Lufthansa. I mean, these are all companies, you know, that have great reputations for maintenance on the world scale. And so I think that that type of information should give you some encouragement that any aircraft that are maintained by these companies, including Rolls-Royce engines, is going to be not only world-class, but it's also going to be entirely acceptable by the Canadian authorities.
Monsieur Trethewey?
Monsieur Trethewey?
Mr. Trethewey?
Je n'ai pas grand-chose à... Je n'ai...
Safety. If the concern is about safety, safety should be regulated rather than forcing operations to be at any particular location. I think you addressed the issue head on through safety regulation and safety management systems and oversight.
Merci. On est dans un...
Thank you. We're in a special case here where Air Canada, one company, was privatized at the end of the 80s, 88, 89, with certain conditions. Among them, there was a requirement to retain jobs in Canada so as to be able to ensure a certain level of service for the overhaul and maintenance of Air Canada planes, but allowing us as a country to retain good jobs here, to help communities and help taxpayers, people who pay taxes. This was protected under the law. And there was a case where the company ceased to respect the law. There was a loss of jobs for some 2,600 individuals. That was the original agreement. We were supposed to retain these jobs. Here, the workers litigated. They won in the Superior Court and the Court of Appeal. And they won because there was a problem and the law was not respected. And now the government is retroactively going to authorize Air Canada to do what it wasn't entitled to do in 2012. As citizens, do you deem that this is responsible behavior on the part of a government to authorize a company to go ahead with an illegal decision taken just 4 years ago, saying, fine, no problem, keep going? What message does that send to citizens with regard to the respect of the laws of this country? There's no rush. Take your time.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll start on that one and then ask Mike to comment. I think you brought both Mike and I together to talk to you about some of the policy issues as they relate to aviation policy, as opposed to dealing with rather complex issues that more are in the political and the legal framework in the province of Quebec. So I'm not entirely sure that that's a fair question to both of us.
Mr. Trethewey?
So if I add a few remarks, this has been 30 years, and in that 30 years, we've seen new important airlines created and grow, whether it's WestJet and Porter or Air Transat and so forth. And the government, rightly or wrongly, decided to use competition. And I would suggest that airlines that go bankrupt, and typically after the second round of bankruptcy, there's no more airline. That's not protecting jobs. I don't fully understand the question. It sounds like it's a political question. If you choose to have a competitive environment as the basis for your policy, there are a range of competitive issues there, and maintenance is one of the important ones because it's such a large portion of aircraft cost. And you have one airline that has to compete with other airlines that don't have these restrictions. Again, my advice is focus on safety and tax policy to create incentives for these jobs to be located in Canada, as well as manufacturers. Where the manufacturer is, you tend to get a lot of jobs clustered around them.
Thank you very much,
Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trethewey. We're now on to Mr. Fraser.
Thank you very much, and Madam Chair, I will be sharing my time with Mr. Hardy, so I'll try to keep my questions brief, gentlemen. One of the answers questions we posed to the minister, they weren't quite sure of the answer. But you mentioned government-owned airlines, Mr. Trethewey, are the exception. Are you aware of any other jurisdiction where they actually regulate the location where maintenance work or a corporate headquarters must exist?
I know places where they used to, like Australia, no longer do that. I don't believe the U.S. has any regulations on that. I confess I don't know the details for Germany, but Lufthansa Technik has actually grown into a global maintenance group, and I don't believe that Lufthansa is actually required to utilize them, but I confess I don't know the details on that. I'd say the norm throughout the world is no restrictions on where the maintenance has to be done.
And as a follow-up, in a jurisdiction like Australia that's made the change, what has been the impact on the aviation industry and maintenance work in their continent?
Australia has, I believe, grown in total maintenance jobs, but not so much on the heavy checks. They tend to move offshore into much larger plants where they can even out the flow of maintenance. I mean, Qantas has got 12 A380s, and they can't possibly justify, a maintenance line for the heavy checks for that aircraft. But as that market has grown overall, because they've become more competitive, we see more of the line checks. What I'm optimistic for Canada is because we have aircraft production here, not just in Montreal but also in Toronto. I see the opportunity for us to build a bigger maintenance base in a country like Australia could.
Mr. Wallace, you focused a little bit on the sort of fettered discretion of the airlines in your opening comments, and you mentioned that a typical airline will have 10 to 15% of its costs eaten up by maintenance. Are you aware of any analysis of the actual costs that the current legislation has in respect of Air Canada?
No, I don't have any information on that.
No, that's fine. Just one quick open-ended question, I guess, before I pass it on to Mr. Hardy. Mr. Trethewey, you mentioned that in some respects the legislation may not go far enough to level the playing field. Do either of you have recommendations on how an amendment to the existing legislation could make Air Canada more competitive?
Well, one aspect, I find it hard to understand why we have a 25% foreign ownership limit in the Air Canada Public Participation Act when Canada Transportation Act has exactly the same limit applicable to the same airline. It just strikes me as being peculiar that that's the case.
Thank you. I'll pass the microphone to Mr. Hardy.
Thank you. I'd like to turn this on its head a little bit. You've both now been engaged by the aircraft maintenance industry, and short of suggesting that we do a race to the bottom with local wages versus the wages that they're competing against in other countries, what advice would you give to Canada's maintenance industry in order to maintain good-paying jobs and a robust presence here in the country?
Well, I don't think anybody's suggesting that there isn't a robust presence in this country. There are a number of maintenance operations across Canada that continue to thrive in maintaining a number of different aircraft types. I can tell you that here in Calgary at the SAIT Aerospace Centre, which is the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology, they have graduates coming out in the area of avionics, airframes, and other areas of maintenance, and they're all getting jobs coming out of that center. So it seems to me that this industry is really quite robust.
Thank you.
If I can add here, I do think the key success factors are things such as investment in training, and sometimes that's educational institutions. Peter made reference here in Vancouver, we have the BC Institute of Technology. Again, their graduates seem to get placed into jobs, but it's also training incentives. For example, Newfoundland Bonding and Composites, more and more parts of the aircraft are composite materials. It takes about 2 years to train somebody to work in that. But then also the tax incentives are extremely important. Maintenance facilities require a lot of investment in equipment, and it requires a lot of investment in parts. And I think a combination of tax incentives and training incentives are absolutely critical for this.
All right, that's 30 seconds left.
Well, then just quickly, how close are we then to having ideal conditions to ensure that that industry continues to be, as Mr. Wallace says, pretty robust and has growth potential? How close are we to that?
I think we have a ways to go. When I look at some other countries, for example, I run an annual conference in Europe. Most of the time we're in Germany, and when I look at the education programs there and the funding they have for both trades education as well as more higher maintenance engineering type education, Canada's a long way away from the type of incentives to get people to major in the hard aspects of our economy, trades, engineering, and so forth. And we're also, I think, pretty far behind in terms of incentives on the taxation side for investments in transportation generally, not specific to air transport. I think it's a general problem in Canada that Dr. Emerson actually identified as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sutter. Mr. Iacono?
Gentlemen, in your view, was privatizing Air Canada the right thing to do? And how does C-10 fit into this logically? And might this encourage Air Canada to do more maintenance outside of Quebec, Manitoba, Ontario?
Well, if I start, I actually think privatizing Air Canada was a very enlightened thing to have done. Like I said, the rest of the world now has got private airlines. There's really only exceptions where you no longer, where you still have government owned airlines, and often there are problems associated with that. Air Canada had a lot of challenges it had to face to become a truly private airline, and I think that since 2003, and especially in the most recent years, I think we've seen some tremendous changes there. At the same time, we've also also been able to grow other private airlines. I think we often forget, like, I remember just prior to Air Canada being privatized, it would cost me, for economy class, $2,900 in 1985 to travel from Vancouver to Ottawa. We didn't have discount airfares. We had very high-cost airlines, and the most recent trip I took, I think, was $399 a return. I think this has served Canadians well. We can go further, but I think this has served Canadians well.
I'd like to just echo that. If you'd asked me that question a number of years ago when I was an officer of Canadian Airlines, my answer may have been slightly different relative to the benefits of privatizing Air Canada. But I think in the fullness of time, it was the right decision, and I think the economy of the country has benefited from it.
You have 4 minutes left. Any of you want to share that time, or we will move on to the, okay, Ms. Watts for 6 minutes.
And I'm going to share it as well here. We'll take their other 4. I just need to just have an indication here. You had mentioned that Australia has some facilities in Australia than elsewhere, and that there's some other countries are more competitive outside of Canada. Other than you mentioned Germany, which is on the forefront. Can you give me a bit of an understanding where those centers are and sort of why they're like top in the world?
If I start here, certainly, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Singapore, and I think in Singapore's case, it's definitely tax differences that have encouraged the type of investment you need in the modern high economies of scale, high specialization. So Singapore actually has picked up a lot of the work specifically from Australia there. I mean, the list goes on. There certainly are developing world countries that have picked up some of this. Brazil is an example, but we have to remember that Brazil is also a manufacturer of aircraft. So Bombardier, its main competitor until recently, now it's competing with Boeing and Airbus, but its main competitor until recently has actually been Embraer aircraft. They make wonderful aircraft that in fact see service here in Canada, but Brazil has been much more aggressive in its training programs and in its tax incentives for investing in modern aircraft maintenance.
And what about Mexico? Anything on that front?
I confess I'm not as familiar with Mexico. They don't have a manufacturing sector there, and they have severe constraints in its airports. I confess I can't think of any examples of aircraft from Europe or North America or Australia that go to Mexico for maintenance. They certainly maintain Mexican aircraft for both the big airlines and all of their new low-cost aircraft.
What about China?
China is increasingly developing both aircraft manufacturing. They have products that compete with Bombardier now. They assemble A320s and other aircraft in China, and I'm expecting that they are going to become very aggressive in entering the aircraft market. But the good news is that the order book, or the number of aircraft, just narrow-bodied aircraft, are expected to be 30,000 built in the next 20 years. The world does not have enough capabilities. China's going to fill that, but I actually think Canada can do that with the right policies and incentives. And I think this bill is positive in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Peter?
I just simply like to add that I don't know anything about Mexico's capacity. I haven't been able to find anything when I was researching for this appearance. But clearly, Air China, Technique, and Amico in Beijing are two of the up-and-comers when it comes to the whole area of aircraft maintenance.
Right. Perfect. Thank you. Go ahead.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. You're going to have to follow with interpretation, most probably. You brought up an interesting point. You had the opportunity to answer at the beginning of the presentation earlier in saying that there was no other legislation requiring air carriers to do the maintenance work of their aircraft in their country. But Mr. Trethewey, you brought up a point. In Singapore, there's a tax regime that favors investments, so there is state intervention to foster maintenance of aircraft in Singapore. And it's a regime that costs money to taxpayers in Singapore. Mr. Trethewey, first.
Certainly state intervention is important, and not just in aviation maintenance, but in the film industry. There's lots of industries. My own opinion as an economist is that state intervention through forcing carriers that have to compete to do things a certain way is not the way to go. If state intervention is there, it should be in the form of incentives for education and incentives for investment, and that's what they've done in Singapore very successfully.
Monsieur Wallis, quelque chose à ajouter?
Mr. Wallace, something to add? When I asked you my question, it's because the law to date allows us to sustain jobs. We're talking about 2,600 jobs in Canada, and this doesn't cost taxpayers anything to sustain these jobs. It's important. Do you know how much the state invests in Singapore to create conditions such that air carriers throughout the world choose to go to Singapore? Because as far as quality goes for maintenance work, I think that Canadian engineers and the engineers in Singapore are just as good. I'd have a slight preference for ours here, but I'll let you answer the question.
In Singapore, I do know that aviation is one of their strategic sectors. They don't have a mining and forest industry, for example, so aviation is one of the most important sectors that they invest in. I agree that I have a preference for Canadian engineers and maintenance as well, but I am concerned about the focus on only the 2,600 jobs in maintenance. Remember that airlines operate with about a 2% profit margin. It's one of the thinnest profit margins of any transport industry, and we can and do see airlines go bankrupt. We've had 60 airline bankruptcies in Canada, and Air Canada itself has gone through one bankruptcy. I think we have to focus on the bigger issue, and that is the health of the air carrier, and we want to make sure that they have safe maintenance, but in the end, we're going to generate more jobs by creating incentives for competitive maintenance and competitive air carriers that are healthy and grow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trethewey. On to Mr. Fraser.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll pick up where I left off earlier. I think you'll have to forgive me. I think one of you mentioned both the recent Air Canada purchase, but as well as the major Delta purchase. Can you describe to me the impact that you think this may have in terms of a ripple effect in the industry, and whether we may see an increase in maintenance work in Canada as a result?
I would like to take a crack at this. As I said, I think this is a magnificent aircraft that as the market appreciates it. So Lufthansa, Delta, Air Canada, these are major global airlines that purchased this aircraft. I think that the sales of this aircraft will grow quite significantly. At the same time, there's an enormous opportunity because nobody is maintaining this aircraft. It's a brand new aircraft, and somebody somewhere in the world, because we already have 350 orders, that will probably grow eventually into the 1,000 range. Somebody somewhere is going to find the opportunity to develop a heavy maintenance operation line for that aircraft. It would be natural to put that here in Canada, and we have to make sure that our policy is, instead of forcing Air Canada to do things a particular way in the government's wisdom, we have to make sure that there are incentives for the investors to build those facilities in Canada, to train Canadians to do this maintenance, and then Delta, Lufthansa, others will take advantage of that because because this will be the place that it can be done. There's no place in the world that's maintaining this aircraft right now.
Mr. Wallace, do you have any input on that question?
No, I agree with that answer. As I said a little earlier, the opportunity to create a center of excellence in Montreal as the location for maintaining this new series of airplanes is a huge one, and I'm sure that I'm not the first to have mentioned that.
Excellent. Shifting gears just a little bit, you mentioned, Mr. Trethewey, the razor-thin margins in the aviation industry. Do you see the existing legislation having an impact on aviation or air travel costs for Canadians?
Well, I think it'll have an impact on air travel costs for people flying Air Canada. It will help them get better competitive choices that maintain the high safety standard that Canada requires of them. And as they become more competitive, that I think will get translated down not just for their customers, but customers of the other airlines that they compete with, both Canadian airlines like WestJet and Porter, as well as foreign carriers that fly in and out of Canada.
Mr. Wallace, I see you nodding in agreement. I take it you sort of accept that answer as your own, or do you have further input as well?
No, I'd very much like to associate myself with that answer.
That's great. Well, look, I'll give you a chance to take a crack at this one first because I put it to Mr. Trethewey in the previous round. He mentioned that Bill C-10 may not go far enough, and he mentioned the foreign ownership restrictions in his answer. But do you see any opportunities that are not covered by Bill C-10 that we could take advantage of to make Air Canada more competitive?
Well, I think what I've done is I've looked at it and I've given the legislation, I guess, the widest, most beneficent reading. And as I said at the outset, you know, what this legislation does is it gives Air Canada the opportunity to continue to carry out maintenance in the 3 centres identified in the legislation. In the 3 provinces now identified in the legislation. But it does not restrict Air Canada from taking the opportunity to move into world markets to get some maintenance done in other parts of the world where it's to their cost advantage to do so. So I think that you know, the legislation as it's written will create circumstances for those who are concerned about the maintenance, loss of maintenance jobs, to be less concerned. Line maintenance is still going to continue. I'm sure there's going to be a wide range of maintenance services continued to be provided by Air Canada in those locations and locations across Canada. I read that legislation in the most wide and beneficent way.
I'm going to have to call an end to our witnesses and thank them both very much for your testimony today. We appreciate you very much taking the time and sharing your tremendous knowledge with the committee. Thank you very much. I will suspend for 30 seconds so that we can disconnect our teleconferencing system. We have committee business coming up for the remaining 5 minutes of our meeting. I've suspended the meeting. Just a minute.
Thank you. Okay, off you go.
Okay. Resuming the meeting. How's that? We'll resume the meeting.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Fraser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think you'll find if you check with the clerk that that I submitted a motion last week that I'd like to bring to the committee's attention. I don't know if you'd like me to proceed with reading the motion now, or should we give everyone time to get it out?
I believe everybody has received the motion previously.
It's the same one that went out, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you change it?
No, not that sneaky.
Mr. Secan?
I'd like to go in camera.
Mr. Secan has suggested that we go in camera.
Madam Chair?
All those in favor?
If you go in camera, I won't have a chance to say a single word.
Yes, we will.
This motion directly affects my rights.
What is the wish of the committee? All those in favor of going in camera? well, it's not going in camera. So we have before us Mr. Fraser's motion. Everyone has it. I'm concerned about time ahead of us. Another committee is coming in here at 5:30. So we have a motion before us. Ms. May has asked to speak to this motion. Someone on the committee, in order for Ms. May to speak to it, needs to give her their time. And is there someone on the committee that is prepared to give Ms. May their 2 minutes or so to be able to speak to the motion?
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair, I give my 2 minutes to Ms. May.
Beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boulris. It's a great honor for me to be given your time.
And I've had a very difficult experience since fall 2013 when an identical motion to this one was pushed through every committee by the previous Conservative majority for the sole purpose of depriving me of my rights at report stage to put forward substantive amendments to legislation. Brief history to this is that in the past, all members of Parliament could put forward amendments at report stage, either substantive or deletions. In 1999, the Reform Party used their opportunity at report stage to put forward about 700 amendments, most of them trivial and deleterious, to slow down adoption of the NISGA Treaty. As a result of that misuse of report stage, a new procedure was adopted by the majority Liberal government at the time. It took a couple of years to make the change, that members of Parliament who'd had the right at committee to make substantive amendments could not make them later at report stage. This created only one group of MPs who still had the right to make amendments at report stage, members of Parliament who did not have the right to sit in committee as a standing member of a committee, such as members such as myself of the Green Party, where you have fewer than 12 MPs, the Bloc, or any independent MPs. We were the only ones left who had the right to put forward amendments at report stage that were substantive because we weren't members of committee. This was an invention of the previous Conservative majority because they, as a majority party, disliked even one MP being able to bring forward amendments at report stage that were substantive. And so while it looks on the face of it as though it's giving new rights or new opportunities to members of Parliament who are not in recognized parties of more than 12 MPs, it is in fact removing rights from smaller parties, discriminating against MPs such as myself who have precious few rights in this place as it is. I would urge you and beg you not to pass this motion. This will mean that I'll be coming to your committee at every clause by clause, and I will be allowed to speak, if history is any guide, for 60 seconds to my amendments, not allowed to respond if people suggest friendly amendments, not allowed to explain, not allowed to vote, and certainly not allowed to bring forward a substantive amendment at report stage. Report stage happens only once a day. Clause by clause can happen simultaneously in many committees at the same time.
Thank you very much, Ms. May. Apologies, but we are very tight for time, given the fact that there is another committee coming right in behind us here, so we have to vacate the room. We have a motion before us from Mr. Fraser. Any further debate? Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? Thank you all very much. Meeting will be adjourned.